Good afternoon and welcome. I want to welcome you all to this very exciting event. We don't often have Israeli writers come to campus, especially young and on the cusp of their fame and acclaim. So I first want to welcome Iddo Gefen here. I'm going to make a brief introduction and then we have a second special guest. So first of all, for those who are not in my class on Holocaust literature, I'm Professor Maxim Shrayer. And this is a kind of hybrid event. It's a guest lecture, but it's also a public lecture. In my Holocaust literature class, we study Holocaust literature from its beginnings, from the time of the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, the earliest literature by witnesses and survivors, and all the way to the present. And of course, we talk about Israel. And in fact, it so happens that we just read Hannah Arendt's report on the Eichmann trial, and we spoke a lot about the legacy of the Shoah in Israel's past and present. So thank you for that, Iddo. And I also want to say that our special guest, whom I'd like to introduce, is Deputy Consul General of Israel to New England, Daniel Agranov, who is here. He's going to make a few opening remarks. I just want to say that he may look young, but he is already a very experienced and seasoned diplomat, and I'm particularly happy that his roots, like mine, are in the former Soviet Union. He was born in Leningrad. He made Aliyah at the age of 11, and he's since had a number of very important diplomatic posts, including that of Israel's first consul to St. Petersburg. Welcome, Consul Agranov.
Thank you very much. First of all, of course, I want to thank Maxim Shrayer for inviting us and inviting also Iddo here. I think learning Holocaust and learning about what happened in Europe, it's a very important task. To tell the truth, I didn't heard about the schools for long. I just learned about it, but I think it's a very interesting way of learning about Holocaust. I think learning about what happened in our history is very important to all of us, and also for understanding what is happening now and what can happen, unfortunately. I myself see in the Holocaust a very important field, and I also, before coming here, I worked in the ministry in the Department of Fighting Anti-Semitism and Remembrance of Holocaust, and I also was an Israeli representative to IRA, International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. So I really, you can say, dedicated part of my diplomatic career to remembrance of Holocaust, and unfortunately, it's also very relevant today. First of all, it's very nice to see young faces, and without mask, it's lovely. It's really, I for the last 2 years, we sit in offices, and most of our events were in Zoom, so it's just fun to be here and see you all. Thank you for coming. Thank you for also participating in this important course. I'm sure you will learn a lot. So I'm here not to talk with you about Holocaust, although it's also been an interesting discussion after maybe you finish your course. But I'm here to present Iddo Gefen. He is really a young writer. As Maxim mentioned, he is just in the beginning of his career, but it's also looked like a very, very great beginning. His books, his first book, just was translated to English. You see this here. And you can buy it, I'm sure, in Amazon. Yes. We also, I think, as a person, as a reader, and I read like 2-3 books every week. I think that writing short stories, and this is a short story book, it's one of the most difficult genres in writing, because to put the story, to start, go and end the story in a couple of pages, I think it's the most difficult way of writing. And again, it's my own idea, but also it's also interesting. I tried it, I read it, so I advise all of you to read it. And he did a wonderful job to include such interesting ideas in such a short stories. But he's here also to talk about his family roots and about his grandfather that survived the Holocaust in Lithuania. And it's also very important, and for me, and I'm sure also for Maxim, that we, as he mentioned, came from Soviet Union. Many of our relatives perished in the Holocaust. Those stories, unfortunately, untold yet. And when I look at my kids, and I'm thinking about many generations of my relatives that are not here because of the Holocaust, it's remind me the importance of remembering the Holocaust and doing the events about the Holocaust. And we're very happy that this event is happening here, and with this very interesting twist of Israeli author talking about Holocaust and his family connection to it. So thank you again for Maxim Shrayer, and thank you again all, and I hope we'll meet again.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Before I finally surrender the floor, which, as you know, takes me always a long time, I just want to add that this lecture is sponsored by the Department of Eastern Slavic and German Studies, the Consul General of Israel, the English Department, and the Jewish Studies Program. And I'd like to thank all of our sponsors and co-sponsors. Iddo Gefen, please take it away.
Is it okay if I take out the mic? Great. I have never got so many introductions in my life. That's enough for a lifetime. But I'm really happy to be here. As they said, I'm Iddo. I'm 29 years old. I'm from Israel. And I'm on a book tour after... Okay, this Zoom stuff is really enough. And I'm here to talk about my book, Jerusalem Beach. I'm in book tour about the book, but when Maxim talked to me, he told me about this course, and I said, okay, this is gonna be tricky. But I thought it would be a very interesting opportunity to talk also about the book and also about my personal connection to the Holocaust and how it affected the way I wrote this book. So now I will just try to deal with the Zoom thing. Okay. So I want to start, but wait. Sorry.
Beautiful.
So I want to start by saying that I came from a family that stories was something very important. Today in my life, besides being a writer, I also work in neurocognitive research, trying to understand how we understand stories in the brain and what makes us love stories and why do we love stories so much. And when I was a child, I would get to my grandfather's house in Jerusalem. He was a Holocaust survivor. And he had a brother named Joseph, and they would tell a lot of stories about their time in the Holocaust. They were in Lithuania, and they hid for 3 years. And they really loved to tell stories, the both of them, but there was a problem. My grandfather was a very bad storyteller, while Joseph was the best storyteller I ever knew. He made like every time he talked about it, every day they had there in Lithuania, sounded like sort of an adventure and so many dangerous stuff that happened. And he talked about days where they almost died and he saved my grandfather and the opposite. And I remember that once my grandfather, Joseph told this amazing story, and my grandfather smiled at him and told him in the end of the story, "Listen, Joseph, this is a fantastic story, don't take me wrong, there's only one problem. I don't think it happened." And then Joseph looked at him and said, "You're right, but that's how it should have happened." And then he continued telling the story we know it was fiction, but still he told it completely like as it is a real story. So since I was a child, I understood that stories are something that are very important and can really affect people. But I have to say that personally I didn't like reading, and that's because I'm dyslexic. And when I was 8 years old, I still didn't started reading, and I didn't have the ability to read. One day, my big sister, who was a really serious bookworm, brought this book, which is Harry Potter in Hebrew, and she sat next to my bed and said, "Okay, listen, I'm gonna read the book Harry Potter out loud. Whoever in the audience wants to listen, he's welcome." Like, I was the only audience there. She was my big sister. I didn't have a lot of options. I thought she was annoying as hell, but she just started reading the book, and every day she would read a chapter, and after a few days I fell in love with the characters and the plot and the stories, and I assume many of you also feel the same about this book. And when we got to the end of the book, she said, "Okay," I told her, "Let's go to the second book, this is fun." And then she said, "Okay, but now you'll have to read one page from every chapter." And I was like, okay, this is the best bargain I can have. I didn't know how to use Audible, or like, how is it called when you like listen to stories? Audiobook. I didn't know how to do it that time, so that was the best thing I could do, and that's how I started reading, and I really fell in love with reading books. And well, this is the desk I wrote my first stories on, and as you have already seen, it looks like this most of the times. It's not like a writing desk completely. It's the table where we usually eat our Shabbat dinners. As you can see, this is me, not shaved. This is the sister that taught me how to read, another sister of mine, my parents, my grandmother, a lot of family all around. And what happened is, when I was in high school, I wanted to be an NBA player. As you can see, I have the height to also do that. But I'm also a very, I come from a Jewish family where parents say what you should study, and I was very influenced by that. And I don't know how they managed to set this up, but they actually convinced me that the best thing I can do for being an NBA player is studying in a science class. Like, till this day, I'm not sure how I thought it was reasonable, but they said, like, they have this really good basketball team. You'll get there, you'll start there, you'll get in the basketball team. I did not get in the basketball team. I was stuck in a class I didn't like at all. I hated the study. It was really hard for me, all the math part, and I really wanted to get out of there. And I remember that one day they took us to how's it called, the place where you see
Planetarium?
Planetarium, yes. This is in Givatayim, which is a city in Israel. It's a really small place. And I didn't understand what I'm doing in that class at all, so I certainly didn't understand what I'm doing there in the middle of the night. But we went there, and we went up the planetarium, and when we walked the stairs, we saw, like, there was a switch, much bigger than this one. It was also black, and there was also a sign written very clearly, "Do not touch." And I looked at it, and I said to myself, okay, maybe if I'll touch the switch, I'll get home much earlier. I didn't know, okay. But I was, I have to say, also quite a coward in stuff like that, so I didn't to put on the switch. But when we got up to the planetarium, and we had this lecture about the solar system, and how there's night and day, the whole time this is not interesting. The only interesting thing is, what does this do? And I don't know why, but in one particular moment, I thought to myself a really weird thought, that maybe this guy who is talking to us now about physics and about night and day and how it all works, maybe he's just fooling us. And this is not true at all. And maybe there's a much better, simpler explanation, and that is, there's a guy in Givatayim that his job is to wake very early in the morning, go to that switch, use it, and then the sun comes up, and then he drinks a cup of coffee, he goes to sleep maybe, comes back in the evening, switches off the switch, and the sun comes down. And in that moment, I think it was the first moment I have had an idea for a story. I didn't understand it's an idea for a story because I came from a family that nobody had background in art. Writing is not something I knew about, but I knew I had this idea I wanted to explore, and I didn't know how to do it. So I did the only thing I did know how to do, and this is Google in Hebrew, איך להיות סופר, how to be an author. And the first thing that came up was a picture of Hemingway, the author, with a typewriter and a glass of scotch. And I said to myself, okay, if it's good for Hemingway, it's good for me. And I did manage to find a typewriter and a glass of scotch. This is the typewriter. This is not the original scotch. The typewriter I found in the basement of my grandfather and grandmother. And the scotch, now it's years later, so I can tell the truth, that in Ra'anana, the city I lived there, there's a specific supermarket that if you come on Friday on a good time, they won't ask for ID, and you can buy alcohol if you need the details. Anyways, I went back home and I tried to write my first story on a typewriter with a glass of scotch. I did it in my room because I didn't want my parents to know. And that was the last time I tried to write a story on a typewriter or with a glass of scotch. It went horrible. But from that, I started working with this old laptop, and I wrote my first stories there. And afterwards, I went to the army, and I was a reporter in the newspaper of the army. And just so you know, in Israel, many times when people when politicians want to laugh about other politicians that they didn't do a real army service, they say they were a reporter in the news, news reporter in the army. So that's me. But I had a chance to continue writing over there, and after. During my periods in the army, I didn't sleep too much. And I remember the one time I went to the nursery home my grandfather and my grandmother lived in Jerusalem. And I have, the place they lived in, it's such a crazy place with, a lot of gossips between the old people and a lot of, stories and, you have, gangs or something like that. It's really a really funny place. And I think because I didn't sleep enough those days, I had also this weird idea one day what would happen if people at the age of 80 would join the army and how would it look like. And actually that became the first story of this book about a 80-year-old guy who joins the army because he doesn't know how to deal with the fact that his wife passed away. So that was actually one of the first stories that I had, but I was still far from writing a book. And after I finished my army service, I knew I wanted to continue writing. I didn't know where or how, but I did have kind of an idea that the best place to work when you're trying to write a book is in a bookstore. So I worked in this bookstore in Ra'anana, which is really near the house of my parents. Tzomet Sfarim is the name of the bookshop. It's like Barnes and Nobles. It's a chain of bookstores. It's not something local. And I have this fantasy that I will sit there and read all day, and at night I will write maybe in my typewriter and have this amazing writer's life. And then the first thing my boss told me when I got the job was the first and most important rule: you never read on a shift. So I understood I would never get inspiration while I worked there. And also I figured out, that was very surprising, as a bookseller, you need to know how to sell stuff, which was also an ability I did not have in any way. And also I found out that the most important thing for a bookseller is to know how to wrap out presents in a nice way. I was also very bad in that. Even once, one of the customers just said to me, "Listen, you're not meant for this. Let me." And that was very embarrassing. So as you can see, my period in the book store that lasted about a year wasn't good as I thought, and I didn't write as much as I wanted to. And I understood that maybe what I need to get more inspiration and to write more is to travel the world. And a lot of Israelis, what they do after their army service, they go and travel mostly far Asia or South America for long travels. There's also a name from it in Hebrew and slang. It's called the track of the hummus, Shvil of hummus. And the reason we call it like that is because you're going to places where there's a lot of Israelis, and you know you'll always find hummus in the place you're traveling in. And in a way, I just went with what I thought I was supposed to do, and that's travel like the people I knew. And I come from a family that loves to travel a lot. My parents are real travelers, but they're also very weird travelers. They don't travel in classic places where tourists go to, but to very ordinary, normal cities that nobody go to. For example, this is the city Be'er Yaakov, which Amir here can tell us that he probably never heard about somebody who goes to Be'er Yaakov to photo a house there. I really don't know what they did there. This is my parents in a museum in a kibbutz where they went to the museum only to find out that nobody went to the museum, so it was closed. So they needed to find somebody in the kibbutz that opened, especially for them, the museum, and even didn't know what was in the museum. And I asked them before this lecture to send me one normal picture just so I could show they're also having normal trips abroad. And this is what my mother sent me with great pride. This is my father in New Jersey, Hoboken. Now, I told her, I'm pretty sure you were in New York on that trip, so why did you send me a photo from New Jersey? And then she said, what do you mean? Elvis Presley was born there. Of course you want to see that. So as you can see, I love traveling, but in a weird way. I'm a bit like them in that sense. But I found myself going to Nepal, where it was a year after the earthquake that was there. So I volunteered for a month in a small village, and then I went hiking with a friend from there at the Annapurna, which is like a famous hiking trail that you go for 2 weeks in the Himalayas. And it was a really, really nice experience, but as I said, I wasn't completely, I didn't know how to travel properly, I didn't have the right equipment, and actually after a few days I felt bad and had pneumonia. And unfortunately I had to be evacuated with a helicopter, and I have a photo from that. And this is me, but I'm not the guy who's smiling, I'm this guy. And the guy who's smiling is a very good friend of mine, David, who really wanted me to say in this lecture that he was nice to me and helped me get to the helicopter. So he was nice to me and helped me get to the helicopter, but he was also very excited from that. So after I was like 2 days in the hospital, I took my phone, and was the first thing I saw, and this is probably the best picture I will ever have. But while I was in the hospital, I started thinking a little bit about my trip and what will happen after I'll finish my stay in the hospital. And like I thought, maybe to go to India or places where usually Israelis go traveling. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought that this trip that I want to do is not the trip I really want to do. It's a trip that a lot of people around me are doing, so I feel I need to do it, or that's the thing I'm thinking of, but it's not the thing that interests me. And I also felt that there's something in trying to get out of your regular environment and people, because I think whenever you go to another place and somebody knows you and asks you, where have you been to high school or something like that, he automatically puts you in a box and stuff you come from, and you have this identity that I just want to try something new in another place. So I just changed after my stay in the hospital. I changed completely my travel, and I went to Spain to the Camino de Santiago, which is an amazing route that crosses from France to North Spain. I traveled there for a month. It was a very, very fun and amazing experience. And what's very special about that trail is that a lot of people just start to talk with each other from all kinds of countries and tell their story. And people tell their story all the time. And I had a few conversations with people that heard that my grandfather was a Holocaust survivor, and they asked me questions about it. And I have to admit, I didn't have a lot of answers. Like, I knew his story, I knew he was in Lithuania, I knew he was a Holocaust survivor. My grandfather spoke very openly about those stuff. There's a lot of Holocaust survivors that didn't speak about it because of trauma, or because they didn't want to tell their children because they were afraid they would have sort of a trauma. But my grandfather was very open. But still, when I tried to think about the details, what exactly do I know besides the fact that he had 3 years, I didn't know the specific things and details, and I felt it was time for me to maybe try to understand what really happened there. Wait. And so I found myself having this, like, my first intent was to go to Lithuania, which is the place where he lived and had most of this story. But I have to admit, I had a really hard time doing it because my grandfather never came back to Lithuania. He was an ambassador, he traveled all across the world, but he never wanted to go back there because of the feeling that that was the country he felt a part of and grew up in, and had these awful experiences there, and he felt it's a place he can't go back to, and it was like a wound that never healed in that sense. And I think this wound also, we also felt it in our family. Like, nobody, like, he traveled all across the world. He was in Eastern Europe in a lot of places, but Lithuania specifically is a place that we didn't talk about it, but we knew you can't go there because there's something that you can't see or be there. So I couldn't go directly to there. Like, emotionally it was problematic for me. So I decided instead, I took a flight from Spain to Germany to Berlin, and after a few days there, I decided to go to Poland, to a city called Gdańsk, which is near the Baltic Sea. And there's two reasons why I went there. First, it was the cheapest bus I could find. It was €9. And the second is because of a book I really love. It's an Israeli book called Sea Under Love. It's written by David Grossman, who is a very famous Israeli author. and it's a book about the Holocaust with a few stories in it. And the story I love the most is the story about an author who goes to Gansk to try to find the roots of a Jewish writer called Bruno Schulz. I don't know if you talked about him in the course?
Not in this course.
Okay. So Bruno Schulz is a Polish Jewish writer who died in the Holocaust. Grossman himself was deeply affected from him. He's not very known in Israel as well, but there is a lot of people who really adore his work, and there's a lot of research about him, and he's a really interesting writer. And what Grossman said, I once heard him say in an interview, there was a story going around that the way Bruno Schulz died is that he worked with, there was a Nazi officer who he worked for, and one day this officer killed another Jew, and the officer, another officer who worked with the Jew who was murdered, shot Bruno Schulz and said, "You killed my Jew, so I'll kill your Jew." Now, I do need to notice that the historical research says it's probably just a story. There's no evidence for this historically, but Grossman also knew that, but he said that he wanted to understand how can it be even possible to have such a combination of words. You killed my Jew, so I'll kill your Jew, and it can be acceptable in our thought. And he wrote this book, and the specific story is about an author who goes to Gansk to try to understand the story of Bruno Schulz and what really happened to him. And he has in this book this amazing descriptions about the beach there and how amazing it is and his experience there. And I just read the story and thought to myself, this is probably an amazing place. I want to be there. And I went there, and I have to admit it was far from my expectations, mostly because I went on a holiday and everything was closed. The only thing that was open was a McDonald's, which I did not come to Poland only to eat McDonald's. And really, I tried everything like museums, places. I didn't find nothing. I tried to go to the beach. I didn't find it. I found myself like walking 2 hours with my backpack. I saw in one situation like a guy with like a Nazi tattoo, and I was like completely terrified. I really went to another place from that, and eventually I saw the beach. I found it. It was so cold I couldn't be there even 10 minutes, and I was like really. This is really not the experience I thought I would have, and I was really frustrated about it. And I even didn't manage to find a hotel, so I did couch surfing, like when you sleep on a couch of somebody in that place. And I found this amazing Polish couple who hosted me, and she, like the woman that saw me, she immediately understood I was very frustrated. And she said, "You remind me of the two guys who came from Norway in the middle of the winter because the flight only cost 15 euros, but that's because you can't get out of the house. So you look like them." And I was really, again, I wasn't so communicative, I wasn't so nice to her, and I was pretty, even a bit depressed. And the morning after, she said, "Listen, I want to show you something." And I wasn't like sure what is it, and I said, "Where do you want to go?" And she said, "I want to show you a synagogue." And I said, "Oh, okay, she thinks I'm Jewish, I want to see a synagogue. Like, I don't know even how to pray there. This is going to be like very embarrassing to figure it out." But I went with her to that synagogue, and to my surprise, I saw this picture, which is, I had like this very, very bad camera, so it looks like this. But what you see here is a lot of people, playing bridge in the middle of the synagogue, which I never saw in my life, something like that. And apparently they have this like very very good bridge club where people from all around play bridge in the middle of the synagogue. And then I was also surprised there was a lot of Jewish people in the city, which I was sure there's no, the Jewish community didn't live there anymore. And I said to her, wow, this is amazing. There's dozens of people here. They're all Jewish. And then she said, oh, no. Most of them are not Jewish, but they just come with a kippah because they want to play bridge. And the rabbi's approach to it is as long as you know to play a good bridge, he doesn't ask for questions. And I was also sure they would be like very excited to see an Israeli, and they were until they understood I do not know how to play bridge, and then they lost interest. But I think also there I understood that when I try to go to a place in Eastern Europe in general, I need to take all the things I thought I knew and understood about the place and just leave it behind and see where people really live, and not just go to the places where there's museums and stuff like that. And while I was there, I talked to my father. I told him I might go to Lithuania as well, like it was 2 weeks before, and my father was so excited about this idea that he said, okay, I'm going to Lithuania. And I said, wait, I'm not sure if I'm coming. Okay, it's not, I'll go alone, no problem. And he also convinced my mother and my uncle and his wife to join. So I found myself traveling to Lithuania with my family, which is where all these, like most of Israelis go to this trip after the army to like be independent, and I find myself with my whole family like in a big car, but it was nice. And here I get to the story of my grandfather, that my grandfather is named Iddo Gefen. He was born in Lithuania in 1922. Abba in Hebrew is father. In Lithuania, 92% of Lithuanian Jews were murdered, mostly by Lithuanian neighbors. And I think that was something that was very hard for my grandfather. Like, it's weird to say, but in a sense, I think he was more angry at the Lithuanians than the Germans. And he had a lot of, I think he even visited Germany, but he couldn't visit emotionally Lithuania. And he survived 3 years of German occupation together with his brother Joseph, who I told you about in the beginning. And in this, while he was in the Holocaust, he wrote a diary, which I have here in its Hebrew edition. And it's, to our knowledge, one of the only diaries that was written in Hebrew originally. Because he studied in one of the only Hebrew high schools that were at that time, and he knew perfect Hebrew, so he wrote his thoughts in Hebrew. And this is the town he lived in, Simnas, which we visited. Before World War II, there was about 1,500 people, half of them Jews. And today there are 2,000 people, none of them Jews. Just to show you, this was the house of the family where they lived in. This is the big church, as you can see there, a photo from that time. And this is, there you can see the synagogue where my grandfather did his bar mitzvah. That still stands till this day in Simnas. And this is a phone book of people who lived there, a lot of Jewish families that were part of this community, and today there's no one there left. And this is the family. My grandfather, this is his father, Meir, his mother, Ruchama, and his 3 brothers. This is my grandfather here. And his parents, you can see him there. And what happened with my grandfather is that he was in Kovna when the war started in Lithuania, and he studied engineering in Kovnas. And he rented a house with somebody who called Blumenthal, which was a famous, not famous, but known military officer that retired. And what happened when he was in Kovnas, they gathered all the Jews in Kovnas Square, and they took also my grandfather, and when they walked there, he heard people yelling at them like, "We're gonna kill you all." And he thought about running away, and he saw like this really small alley that was like 20 meters from him, and he said to himself, "Okay, when I get to this alley, I'll try to run." But then the person that was in front of him did the same thing and was shot at the place and got killed, so he understood he can't do that. And he went to Kovnas Square, and there he found his landlord, that Jewish officer who was in the Lithuanian army, and one of the officers who gathered the Jews knew him and told him, "Listen, this is not gonna end good for you. Take your wife, get out of here, and go to your house and hide." And his wife, she knew my grandfather, and she said, "He's part of our family. Can he come too?" And she begged to take him too, and the officer agreed. So he escaped from there. There were 5,000 people that were in Kovnas Square that day. To our knowledge, 2 weeks later, none of them stayed alive, and they were all murdered. And this is the house where he was studying in, where he lived, and we took a photograph there in Kovnas. And after that, my grandfather went to the only place he knew, which is Simnas, the place where his family came from. And this is the main street of the city. And he went there, and he went to his parents' house. And his parents were very glad to see him, but he told them, "Listen, everyone, like the Lithuanian officers and people who were there took records of all the people who were here. But because you weren't here when it happened, they don't know you're here. So hide inside the house, don't tell anybody you're here, and just let's see what happens, and we'll hope for the best." And a day later, they took his father and his brother Benjamin on a truck, and that is the last time he saw them. And we know that after a few days, they were murdered in a forest near from there. And you can see here, this is my father, and oh, you don't see the video?
Iddo, you probably need to close this and open the video.
Wait. Oh, okay. 1 second. Here. Show it from here. Oh, I think it won't work because you have to be silent. Let's try one more time. Okay, well, what you should have seen, and I'll find it afterwards in my computer and show you the original video, is them doing a Kaddish, which is a Jewish prayer about those family members, which is the first time ever somebody did it in that place. And as you can see, my father is named Meir after my grandfather's father, and this is an uncle of mine, a cousin of mine called Benjamin, after my grandfather's brother. And what you can see here is afterwards the place where they escaped from, and they started living in houses of farmers that knew the family of my grandfather, and helped them through those times. And there's the night they escaped and found a specific farmer. They went there, my grandfather and his brother Joseph, and suddenly their little brother Yuda, which was like about 6 years old, ran to the house they hid in and told them that their mother wants them to go back to their home. And they told them, like, we don't think that's the right choice, it's not safe, we can't come back, because they were afraid because they were young men, they were around 16 and 14, maybe a little older. They were afraid they would be murdered if they would be found. So they decided to stay, and they told them, stay with us, this would be the safer thing. And Yuda thought for a moment and said, no, I want to be with mother, because they would be nicer to her if she has a child with her. Like, that was the thought he had as a child. And my grandfather does not have a lot of regrets in his life, but one specific regret is that he didn't force Yuda to stay with him. And unfortunately, also a few days later, they were also murdered. This is Yuda, and this is Ruchama, his mother. And also my aunt is named after Ruchama, and my uncle and two of my uncles are named after Yuda. And there's from the diary my grandfather wrote, he wrote a lot. There's a specific paragraph that is shown also in the behind the Hebrew version of the book, and it goes like this: only now I'm proud to be Jew, but only my little notebook and I know it. The day will come when I will be able to tell it to them, to those who humiliated us, to protect you. Sorry, please Lord. Reading my diary makes me glad I thought of keeping one. When the day of freedom comes, I will rewrite this naturally for different, even for the differ. What a job that will be. If I will survive, this diary will stand as a reminder of those times, as a testament for what we have endured. And I think when you read this, you also see that my grandfather was hoping to survive, but he wasn't sure it would happen. And they continued their quest towards other places in the area, and there's a lot of farmers who worked with the father of my grandfather, who was like this businessman and knew him and liked him, and some of them didn't want to help, and of course this is understandable, because in those days helping a Jewish person would mean that your family could be executed if found. But there were also a lot of good people who were there and did help. And there's a video I do want to show you, so I'll find it for a second in my original file. This is my grandfather talking about one of the families. He was there, and they saved him for 9 months. The volume isn't so good, but you can read the. He talks in Hebrew, so it doesn't.
מתחת התלמיד, 9 חודשים של 4 שעות, שזה צריך להגיד. הם היו עניים מאוד. היא נתנה חלקה איתנו את האוכל האחרון, ואנחנו היינו חובה לעזור. זאת אומרת שהיינו צריכים לעבוד בכפרים השונים בסביבה, להביא אוכל לבית. כל מה שנתתי לו, נתתי היא לא תקשה לנו, היא ממש קיבלה אותנו מתוך רצון לעזור את האישה טובת לב. והבנים לא פעם ירשו אותנו, והיא נלחמה עם הבנים. נרקמה עם שלא ירשו. וסליחה, מי שיושב שם בחדר, באים אנשים ושם. הוא לא רואה. למה? לפעמים, כיוון שהיה חם, ואני התחלתי, והתנועה, והייתה ילדה שהיא הייתה תמיד מרגיחה מפקחת, ראתה שמישהו למעלה מתנועה, ויכול להיות מישהו מהאורחים לשים לב, אז היא הייתה קופצת למעלה, היא צעקה, החתול הנבזה הזה, מה הוא עושה שם? אבל הילדה הזאת, שהיא הצילה אותנו מכל מיני דברים. יום אחד אנחנו שכבנו, אחי ואני, על התנור, ומתחת לתנור יש איפה שעתיריים, איפה
Just to explain, he talks here about a young girl from the family that saved him, and he talked a lot about how the story she created of there's a cat there, and that's the reason something moves there, is something that really saved him, and that the story that this young child created is something that saved his life. And I think only when I understood that, I understood also something very basic about the ability of stories to really change and affect our lives in ways where we can't even imagine. And the amazing thing is that when we visited Lithuania, I'll just find this video for a second. We met that girl, that 11 years old girl, who's now was 90 something. She was still alive. We did not know that when we got to Lithuania. We thought she passed away, but through a Lithuanian family who knew the story, they found her. And this is the meeting of this woman with my father.
į mokyklą ėjau.
היא אומרת שאבא נורא אהב אותה. היא הייתה הולכת לבית ספר.
Pareinu, supranti.
I'll tell the story. She tells there that one time she got back from school and she said to my grandfather, do my homework. You need to do it, or else I'll tell about you. And then he said to her, no, you have to do your homework, because then you won't know the material, and you won't have an opportunity in life. And it's just such a crazy story to think, like, as a child, when I studied about the Holocaust in high school and for the story, I thought everything was dark, everything was completely, like, all around with horrible stories, and there was no moments of human interactions. And this crazy story of thinking my grandfather talking with her, she should do her homework while he's hiding in her basement, I think is an amazing way of seeing that the Holocaust is many things. It's a lot of dark and horrible stuff, but you also have these specific points of light where you see amazing human beings like her that saved my grandfather, and also human interactions and stuff that the most normal thing you can think of. And it's so crazy in the world that they live in to think that stuff went that way. So just to finish the story, my grandfather, you can see him here during the time this is my grandfather during the years he hit. A lot of the times in the summer they would go to the fields and be there all day. They said, like, my grandfather always said that he really loved being at that time in the field, because that is the only time they didn't have cockroaches, I think, and stuff like that. So that was the most best experience of those days. And another thing is that my grandfather, all his life, was really, really afraid of dogs and from barking of dogs. And the reason is because he was always fearing that if a dog would bark on him, somebody would find him. And it's something that even at the age of 80, he still was so afraid of this. And when we were there in the area, we heard a lot of dog barking all the time, so we really understood where it came from. Like, this photo was taken a little bit after he was the war ended, and he managed to stay alive. This is the area he was. As you can see, in the winter it was completely snowy, and they had also to find a way, mostly with families that helped them. Some of the times they were just in the fields and been a few days there. And him and his brother managed to survive the war. And this is just one of the families, the Lithuanian families that helped them, and we also met them. It's not the woman you saw before, it's another family that their grandmother helped my grandfather during his time in Lithuania, and this is another one, and this is another family. And I think the amazing thing about it is that, again, I didn't want to touch the whole Lithuanian subject because I thought it was all bad, and everybody there was bad, and every Lithuanian person didn't help Jews. But I knew the stories that there were people who helped them, but I couldn't, like, I was so furious that I couldn't feel it. And meeting those people, meeting that old woman, really gave me a better understanding of there were good people also in these horrible times. And just to finish, my grandfather, after he was released, he joined the NKVD, which I assume know, like, about the term more. It's like the police of the Russian police, and he was helped arrest a lot of the people who were part of murdering Jewish people. One of the stories is that he went to a high school that somebody took a photo of Stalin and put it in the toilet, which was the baddest thing you could do at that time. And then when he talked to the principal, he realized this is the man who was part of murdering a lot of the Jews in the town, and they arrested him. And I think for my grandfather, having a period where he could have kind of this payback for the people who murdered people he knew. I think really helped them also create his own story of which he could continue afterwards in his life. And just to show the diary, this is actually, he took all the things he wrote in little notes that were hidden like this. He would take it everywhere. And one, like in the 70s, he decided he wanted to do a diary to write it, but he couldn't understand his own writing. So he didn't know what to do, and for a few years he did nothing with it. And then he met this publisher who, he told him, like, listen, I think I have a good story, but there's no way of reading it. And like the publishers said to him, you're telling me that humanity managed to understand the Egyptian writing thousands of years ago, but there's no way to understand what you wrote? And then he said, okay, you have a point. And for 3 months, he just stayed in the house and tried to understand what he wrote. And they created in Yad Vashem, they took the whole, this whole book and the whole thing he wrote. And this is our family a few years ago, and my grandfather passed away in 2015. But as you can see, he managed to survive and make a big and happy family. And again, for me, I think that being in Lithuania and from them, I understood something very basic about my writing, not only about my personal story, in which the only story I can really write about and tell about is the places where I feel are the most emotionally true, and not trying to write somebody else's story or traveling in places that people assume I should be. And this book is not about the Holocaust. There's no stories about the Holocaust, but I think a lot of the emotional truth I learned from just traveling in Eastern Europe and also from my family found its way to the book, and it's part of the writer I am today and the person I am today. So that's my story.
Thank you so very much. I hope you don't mind taking some questions.
Yeah, sure.
And one of the things we learned is that, and I personally learned, is that not only do you come from a family of Holocaust survivors, you're a second-generation writer, and that too is very important.
Yeah.
And we talked in this class about this being also a generational experience. So please, questions for our guest.
No pressure. Yeah.
So, we know that Jaffa is the port of Jerusalem. What is Jerusalem Beach? That's the title of the book, right?
Yeah. Well, actually, there's no beach in Jerusalem, and the reason I wrote it as such is because I wanted to write about something that sounds familiar but doesn't really exist. And I didn't think about, when I wrote it, I didn't think about the fact that this book would be published and would be translated, and most of the people who would read it would not know this fact. So it's something that is really interesting, that fact. But there was an interesting experience I had with the book. The specific story, Jerusalem Beach, is about a couple who is searching for the beach in Jerusalem. And the reason they do it is because the old woman in the story has Alzheimer's, and the only memory she has left is her being in the beach in Jerusalem, and her husband Sammy knows this is probably an illusion, not something real, but he decides to go with this fantasy hoping it will help her. And the amazing thing that happened is that after this book was published, a reader contacted me and told me that his father has Alzheimer's, and he brought the book to his father, and when he saw the title, Jerusalem Beach, he started crying, and he didn't understand why, because he even didn't have a chance to explain it's about Alzheimer's and nothing. And he talked to him and tried to understand what happened, and he realized his father was a geologist that worked in the mountains of Jerusalem, And millions of years ago, there was a sea in the place where Jerusalem stands today. And he told his son that when he was a young person, he would tell people about his work, and like people wouldn't understand what he's talking about. They're like, there's no beach in Jerusalem. And he said that when he saw the cover of the book, he said, I felt like somebody wrote this book especially for me. Now, I didn't have any chance of thinking of something like that when the book was published, but I think it's another interesting example about how fictional idea can find a way into emotional truth of the readers in a way you can't think about when you're writing the book.
By the way, I should tell you that I'm probably having early onset of senility, because when I first saw Shelley Yerushalayim, I said, oh sure, it's next to Bograshov Beach. You know, I completely imagined. I love the beach, the front of Tel Aviv. And I said to myself, sure, that's just a little beach, right?
Yeah. In Tel Aviv, there's a beach called, there was like the beach, but it's not what I wrote about.
Perfect. So we have a little time left, but I think Iddo, you'll take a few questions, right?
Yeah, sure.
Yes. So any more questions?
Yeah.
Johnny, please.
So like, how's it been like as an author to have your book being translated in?
Yeah.
I don't know if English is the only language it's been translated in, or
it was published also in Korea, and it will be published in China, Italy, and the Netherlands.
So are you like going on all those places? Like,
yeah,
it like as like a coming up author, like seeing this and the experience and
first of all, it's really exciting and really fun, and like it's so crazy just talking about stuff that like seeing other cultures think about the book. For example, the Korean readers, like some reader wrote me an email and he like wrote, wow, the Israeli culture is so weird, and and this is so weird, people live like this, and I think it's pretty normal, I don't know, this is what I know. So it's amazing like to share ideas and feelings through other places, and it's also like challenging to bring story you wrote in your language to another audience and finding the way to communicate it in a way that it would be understandable through the book, and I hope that what will happen. But it's also fun traveling, although COVID did make the whole thing a bit trickier. Like a lot of authors don't do book tours at all these days. I didn't go to Korea because of it, so it's a bit challenging, but very exciting.
Thank you.
I have a question following up on that. Do you work with translators?
I did not translate this book. The translator name is Daniel Agranov, who also her name is on the cover, because personally and my publisher also thinks it's very important for the translator to get recognition for the work, because again, without a good translator this would never happen. And there was a lot of stuff, for example, that we had a hard time in finding a solution to. For example, there's a story in the book called Exit. Now, when I say exit, what do you think about? Like, leave. Okay. Anything else?
Could be.
What?
I said if you go academic, could be like dying.
Okay.
Like actually
That's also an option.
But,
So, like, every Israeli you will say exit will think of two things. One is leave, and the second is doing an exit in high tech, where you have the startup company where is being sold for many dollars, many of millions of dollars, and like the Israeli dream these days is doing an exit. And the story is about a father who has like this dream of a startup company, and his child that hates like the way her parents live decides to live inside her dreams. She just decides this will be my life and dreams more and more every night. So the exit is both like the exit the child did and the exit the parent did. But apparently, I was sure like this is an American phrase because it's in English. But only after the book was translated and I spoke with students, I understood that no, it's not common. So there's all kinds of stuff that are being lost a bit in translation, but I think that's part of the when you try to get to another culture, it's part of the deal. Like when you're reading a book from another place.
Unfortunately, we have to stop here, but Iddo, I just want to thank you so very much.
Thank you.
And we hope you'll come back and talk to us again.
Great, I would love to, and thank you for your time, really.
Thank you.